British mandate to resolve it by means of two states in Palestine. And the fact of the matter is, when the Palestinians formally put forth the demand for a two-state settlement, they anchored it in UN Resolution 181. Unsurprisingly, the partition resolution, because international law moves very slowly, it changes glacially, it's very conservative, and I don't see any point in conjuring fantasies or engaging now in kinds of moral indignation. It happened, it was wrong. I think it's silly to dispute it. It happened, it was morally indefensible. But that's what we now have to work with. And I think the basic, I'm not a great advocate or defender of international law. There are parts of it which I find really repellent, I have to say. On this particular issue, I think the position of the international community is reasonably sensible, and since it includes virtually everyone, I don't see now the usefulness of trying to revise it and repudiate it. I can understand that we're a borderline issue, but all of international law now, as it bears in the Israel-Palestine conflict, starts from the premise of two states. And I can't see any rational purpose in trying now to undo that. That's how it concludes. Quote, Israel has created the occupied territories, a regime of separation based on discrimination, applying two separate systems of law in the same area, and basing the rights of individuals on their nationality. This regime is the only one of its kind in the world, and is reminiscent of distasteful regimes from the past, such as the Apartheid regime in South Africa. That Selm produces another hefty report called Forbidden Roads. Israel, what they call it, Israel's road regime in the occupied territories. Again, looking at the occupation from another angle, what does it conclude? That it bears, I'm quoting again, striking similarities to the racist apartheid regime, and even entails a greater degree of arbitrariness than was the case with the regime that existed in South Africa. It's worse. Okay, some of you say B'Tselem, those are lefties also. All right, let's take Haaretz. They have an editorial in September 2006, and it says, just in passing, no lights, just a passing comment. The apartheid regime, I'm quoting, the apartheid regime in the territories remains intact. Millions of Palestinians are living without rights, freedom of movement, or a livelihood, under the yoke of ongoing Israeli oppression. Just a commonplace. They didn't have to defend the claim. It's perfectly obvious. Shulamit Aloni, she wrote a couple of weeks ago, quote, the U.S. Jewish establishment's onslaught on former President Jimmy Carter is based on him daring to tell the truth which everyone knows. Daring to tell the truth which everyone knows. Through its army, the government of Israel practices a brutal form of apartheid in the territory it occupies. Everyone knows it, but in the United States, it's very controversial. It's even dangerous anti-Semitic, dangerous, anti-Semitic, irresponsibly provocative, foolish, and unfair. In the real world, it's a cliche. In fact, the list of those who hold to the apartheid analogy apparently includes former Prime Minister Ariel Sharon, who reportedly said that, quote, the Bantustan model was the most appropriate solution to the conflict. So it seems even he is dangerously anti-Semitic. When you look at the actual documentary record on the history of the Israel-Palestine conflict, what's most striking is how uncontroversial it was seen to be at the time. I can't go into that history now. It's a long one, not complicated, but it's long. But as most of you know, during the British Mandate period, the period when Palestine was under British control, roughly between 1920 and 1948, roughly that period, there were many clashes, many conflicts between the indigenous population and the Zionist settlers. And every time there was a major clash, the British would send a parliamentary team or a parliamentary group to figure out what's going on here. Why are the natives so restless? And they put together beautiful reports, written in the most elegant English, replete with solid factual information that repays a rereading even today. What's most striking about the reports is when they have to come to the question, why are the natives so restless? They keep saying in the reports, obvious, obvious, obviously obvious. Why is they so restless? Well, the British say all the other states in the region are either have or are on their way to independence. The only one which is being denied that are the Palestinians, as they call them, the Arabs of Palestine. And two, it said, the Arabs of Palestine are worried because they're afraid that when Jews become a majority and declare a state, they're worried about what their fate is going to be in that state. So the British conclude, it's obvious what's going on, not complicated. The solution, they said, is complicated, but the source of the tension and friction, it's not primordial shepherds' wars. It's not cosmic clashes of civilization. It's pretty straightforward. Or take the case of Professor Morris in his book, which is a pretty standard now college textbook. I suspect many of you use it in your classroom, Righteous Victims. At one point, Morris himself asks the question, why do the Arabs oppose Zionism? And he replies, quote, the fear of territorial dispossession and displacement was to be the chief motor of Arab antagonism to Zionism. The fear of territorial dispossession and displacement was to be the chief motor of Arab antagonism to Zionism. Now, some of you are wondering what's so profound about that and why they bothered to repeat it twice. Well, actually, when I came across that line, it kind of leapt off the page for me. And not because, like my students, I was on drugs. It was a metaphorical leaping off of the page. Because notice what he says. He says, he does not say it was anti-Semitism. He does not say it was hatred of Jews. The answer is pretty straightforward, he says. Why did they resist Zionism? Because they feared territorial dispossession and displacement. It was perfectly rational and relatively simple. I was reading the other week Jeffrey Goldberg's book, Prisoners for which he received many, many awards, the New Yorker correspondent on the Middle East. And he concocts this very complicated explanation of how the Arabs resisted Zionism because Muslims can't tolerate in their midst a minority which is more successful than them. And all of these very impressive explanations, but they're also impressively irrelevant. Take the case of North America. Now, the Native American resistance to European or Euro-American encroachment was very bloody. It was not for no reason at all that the Native Americans were called savages. It was a brutal resistance. They killed men, they killed women, they killed children. Not to say the settlers didn't do the same, they did. But we shouldn't fool ourselves about the nature of the resistance. They were yesterday's terrorists and suicide bombers. But what would anyone, rational person, say if, looking at that resistance and asked to explain it, were told, you see, the Native Americans, they were resisting because of anti-Europeanism or anti-Christianism or anti-whiteism. Well, they would laugh just like you're laughing. But the same exotic explanations about the Muslim incapacity to tolerate a successful minority amidst them, those same explanations are equally preposterous and irrelevant. It happens to be the simple explanation, to quote Benny Morris, resist the fear of territorial dispossession and displacement. It happens to be the simple explanation is also a quite sufficient one. You don't need to conjure up complicated explanations. A second kind of illegitimate controversy is the playing of the Holocaust card, the dragging in of the Nazi Holocaust in order to justify Israel's violations of international law in the occupied territories. That's a long topic. I don't have time to discuss it today. I'll just make a couple of brief and pertinent comments. The Holocaust industry emerges after the June 1967 war. Its main purpose was to immunize Israel from criticism. Its main contribution, familiar to everyone in this room, is the claim of Holocaust uniqueness. That is, no people in the history of humanity has ever suffered like the Jews suffered. In fact, intellectually, the doctrine of uniqueness is vacuous, and morally, this ranking of human suffering is an abomination. But its purpose is pretty straightforward. Namely, if you can claim that Jews uniquely suffered during the Nazi Holocaust, then you can claim that they shouldn't be held to ordinary notions of right and justice. That you shouldn't apply to Israel the standards would apply to anyone else because the suffering of the Jews was unique. The way it's played out historically is quite interesting, namely that Palestinians and Arabs generally have been held directly culpable, responsible for the Nazi Holocaust, or seen as lineal descendants of its perpetrators. So, at the time of the 1948 war, David Ben-Gurion called the Arabs, the Palestinian Arabs, disciples and even teachers of Hitler. During the Eichmann trial in 1961, the Arabs were labeled, among the Palestinian Arabs, the Mufti of Jerusalem was labeled as among the biggest Nazi war criminals, and it was said the Mufti even masterminded the final solution. Ben-Gurion said the Mufti was, quote, one of Hitler's closest associates in this genocide. Without going into it, this is all sheer fantasy. In 1967, during Israel's attack on Egypt, Israel said that Abdel Nasser represented the new Hitler. And more recently, as most of you know, Israel's apologists equated Saddam Hussein with Hitler, equate all opposition to Israel's illegal war against Iraq with appeasement of Hitler, and now it's the turn, if you look at the current journals and magazines, now it's the turn of Hamas, Hezbollah, and Iran, all of them being called new incarnations of Hitler and the Nazis. In this case, leading the charge has been Daniel Goldhagen, the author of Hitler's Willing Executioners, and also more recently Benny Morris. Now it's hard to know what's more laughable. The extraordinary coincidence that each new Arab leader allegedly threatening Israel is Hitler incarnate, or that the threat posed to Israel is routinely compared to the Holocaust, while we are told simultaneously that the Holocaust was unique and any comparison between it and other crimes is a form of Holocaust denial. And the two happen at the same time. The most recent form of this playing of the Holocaust card is what's called the new anti-Semitism. And there are two things to be said about the new anti-Semitism. Number one, it's not new. And number two, it has nothing whatsoever to do with anti-Semitism. Every time Israel faces a public relations debacle or international pressure is put on Israel to resolve the conflict diplomatically in accordance with international law, Israel's apologists orchestrate this new anti-Semitism extravaganza. This is a good school with an excellent library, I'm certain. Go and look for yourself. 1974, the head of the Anti-Defamation League is a fellow named Arnold Foster. He and his colleague Benjamin Epstein, they put out a book titled The New Anti-Semitism. 1982, the head of the Anti-Defamation League, Nathan Perlmutter, he and his wife Ruth Ann put out a book entitled The New Anti-Semitism, Central Thesis. What's it called? The New Anti-Semitism. It's now just slipped my mind. The Real Anti-Semitism. Central Thesis, there is a new anti-Semitism. And in recent years, as most of you know, there has been a whole campaign beginning almost exactly with the Second Intifada, roughly around 2001. A whole slew of books came out claiming there was a new anti-Semitism. But what's the evidence for this claim? There are two kinds of evidence that are typically put forward. Number one, the claim is made that college campuses are now rampant with anti-Semitism. In fact, it's said that at schools like San Francisco State University, there have been pogroms committed against Jews. Yes, that's the language. Now, that's an interesting fact. As one of the leaflets that was distributed outside, I think by Hillel, or it was either the leaflet by Hillel or the article, the op-ed in your school paper, it made the correct point that I have been teaching at many universities, more than I prefer. And I have been, as it were, academically around the block more than once. In fact, so many times that I'm getting dizzy. And one thing you could say about universities nowadays, that is, they are now so politically correct, you can't be anti-anything. You can't be anti-Jewish, anti-black, anti-Puerto Rican, anti-tall, anti-small, anti-fat, anti-skinny. You can't even be anti-downright ugly. That's it. The universities are very politically correct. And amidst all this, to be told that there is rampant anti-Semitism and pogroms is just transparently preposterous. And in fact, once the Second Intifada was defeated and things had returned to the status quo ante, all those claims were largely acknowledged to be pure contrivances. So you take the Chronicle of Higher Education, a half year ago it says, quote, "It's a good time to be a Jewish student at an American college." So said Jewish leaders who gathered here Monday and declared that a golden age of Jewishness now exists on college campuses. Not the apocalypse of anti-Semitism is upon us. And so much for the pogroms. We have suddenly discovered it is, as any rational person knows, it's a golden age for Jews on college campuses. The only issue now is, why is Princeton's undergraduate student body only 40% Jewish? That's the main problem. Notwithstanding this glorious time for Jews on college campuses, Yale University, to give one example, recently announced the creation of the first university-based center in North America for the study of anti-Semitism, in order, quote, to understand the current manifestation of this disease. This means it's good news. This means that Yale might soon offer a triple major comprising Judaic studies, Holocaust studies, and anti-Semitic studies in a special degree program titled Jewish Naval Contemplation. Well, let's take the case of Europe. We're told Europe is rife with anti-Semitism. Not at the fringes, but we're told in the heart of Europe. BBC, The Independent, The Guardian, so on down the line, they're all anti-Semitic. Well, how true is that? I recently picked up a decent book of great shakes of Walter Laqueur. For those of you who know him, can hardly be described as anti-Israel, one of its chief apologists. Walter Laqueur puts out a book entitled The Changing Face of Anti-Semitism. What does he say? Anti-Semitism in Europe is predominantly Muslim in character. The popular attitudes towards Jews, he says, were better in 2002 than they were in 1991. Not only is there no new anti-Semitism, but according to Walter Laqueur, there is less anti-Semitism in Europe than ever before. We were told, if you read the titles of these books, if you listened to Abraham Foxman, he said the condition of Jews now is worse than at any time since the late 30s in Nazi Germany. What does Walter Laqueur say? It is difficult to imagine that anti-Semitism will become a crucial factor on the American political or social scene. And he says, it goes without saying that anti-Semitism today is in no way comparable to the persecutions of the 1930s and 1940s. It goes without saying among rational people, but not among those who orchestrate hysterias about a new anti-Semitism to shield Israel from criticism. In fact, nowadays, or I should say a while ago, a few years ago, if you said that the main animus towards Jews and hostility to Jews was due to Israel's ruthless policies in the occupied territories, and that the best remedy was for Israel to end the occupation, it was said that you were an anti-Semite. You were blaming the Jews for anti-Semitism. You are an anti-Semite. You are claiming it's the policies of the Jewish state which are creating anti-Semitism. Now, you open up Haaretz. They're marking the 58th anniversary of Israel's founding. They invite Tony Judd, the American professor at NYU, to write about Israel's founding on its 58th anniversary. And what does Tony Judd write? He says, Israel's reckless behavior and insistent identification of all criticism with anti-Semitism is now the leading source of anti-Jewish sentiment in Western Europe and much of Asia. One way to take the sting out of rising anti-Semitism would be for Israel to give the Palestinians back their land. Rational, sensible statement in the pages of Israel's most influential newspaper, published on Israel's most important day, its 58th anniversary, but in the United States, that's called anti-Semitism, blaming the Jews, blaming the victims for the hostility directed against them. The purpose of this capricious, promiscuous use of the label anti-Semitism, it's pretty straightforward. To turn the perpetrator, namely Israel and its apologists, into the victim, focusing on the alleged suffering of Jews rather than the very real suffering of Palestinians. And secondly, to discredit all criticism of Israel as being motivated by anti-Semitism. One might add, it's an important point, an important topic, one which I don't have time now to go into, that I think that era, the era of hurling these filthy epithets at anybody who dares to criticize Israel, I think that era is coming to an end. In the last couple of years, for reasons which I said would take me too long to go into now, Israel has now suffered from the disaffection no longer of just marginal Jews, but Jews at the center of intellectual and political life in the United States. And when that label was used against them, they have power. And it didn't work. They used it against Tony Judd. Then non-Jews, they tried to use it against Steve Walt and John Mearsheimer. And then they tried to use it against Jimmy Carter. And I think it's fair to say it fell flat. And I think it's the last days of that particular dirty break your kneecaps game. Let me turn to just the last topic, namely the last kind of contrived controversy which has confused or sowed confusion about the Israel-Palestine conflict, and in many ways the most dispiriting. When I listened to Professor Barhoum's introduction, and he quoted me as saying, "I loathe lies," and it's true that lies do energize me. I feel like sometimes I am academia's garbage man. I have to pick up the garbage, well, first I have to identify the garbage, and then I have to pick it up and throw it away. And in the case of the Israel-Palestine conflict, it has to be said there are, quote, large amounts of garbage littering not the periphery and the crackpot ends of the spectrum, but regrettably at the heart of academic life in the United States. To say in general that there's a large amount of fraud on any topic is not a particularly provocative remark. Everybody here knows that of any given topic, if you Google it on the internet, 70% of what comes up is somewhere on the spectrum between lunacy and crackpottery. And about 30% has more or less scholarly value. But it's very different on the Israel-Palestine conflict, because the lunacy is right at the heart of our academic life. And it's validated by our mainstream media and our public life. And I'll try to illustrate that point relatively briefly, and I'll start taking the questions. As everybody here knows in this room, academia has methods of quality control. They're not perfect, but they're reasonably effective. In the natural sciences, they're obviously much more effective than they are in the social studies. So in the natural sciences, the main method of quality control is, of course, replicating an experiment. Somebody says, I mixed a little bit of A with a little bit of B, I add a dash of C, and I got Madonna. And then in laboratories all around the world, they replicate the experiment, mix a little of A with B, add a dash of C, and if they get Oprah, you know something's awry here. Well, I was once told that joke was not politically correct.
It's okay with me.
Okay, thank you. You sound older. Okay. In any case, in the social studies, our mechanisms of quality control are not as effective, but they're relatively successful. And as I said, certainly every scholar or aspiring scholar in this room knows them. So we'll take an example with Professor Barhoum. We meet in the street, and he says to me, well, Norm, calls me by my first name, he says, well, Norm, I heard your lecture last night. I found it quite informative, but on one of the basic questions, I think you're wrong. You said that Israel's human rights record is an abomination, or you certainly implied it. But I just read a book which says that Israel's human rights record is generally superb. And at that point, the skeptic in me comes out. I give that ironic grin, the squinting of the eyes, and the condescension, and I say, really, Professor Barhoum, generally superb. And at that point, I do what any typical academic does. The first thing I say is, who published that book? Because we know that the quality of publishers ranges. You have what's called the vanity presses at one end, the university presses, the refereed presses at the other end. I say, who published that book? And Professor Barhoum says, John Wiley and Sons. Well, we all know that's a reputable publisher, no question about that. So then I go to the second level of quality control. I asked Professor Barhoum, who blurred the book? Who wrote comments on the back of the book? That's also an indicator of its quality. That's why my books have no blurbs. No acknowledgments. Who blurred the book? And he says, but what excellent blurbs. Floyd Abrams, the leading First Amendment authority in the United States, the New York Times' its general counsel, Henry Louis Gates from Harvard, excellent blurbs, okay. So now I go to the third level of quality control. I say, what kind of reviews did the book get? Standard question. He says, reviews. The book got excellent reviews. Got an excellent review in the Boston Globe. Got an excellent review in the New York Times. And not by anyone in the New York Times. It was reviewed by the current deputy foreign editor, namely Ethan Bronner. Gave it an excellent review. Well, at that point, I must say, I am up against the ropes, and I'm down to that last question, that last interrogation, hoping it'll save me. And I ask him, okay, who wrote the book? And at this point, his chest puffs up. Who wrote the book? The senior-most professor at Harvard Law School, Alan Dershowitz. Now, it's true. Excellent publisher, excellent blurbs, excellent reviews, and somebody with, I don't think it's incorrect to say, I think it's very correct to say, an excellent academic pedigree. Graduated first in his class at Yale, youngest professor to gain tenure at Harvard. That's very impressive. And I am second to none, for sure, in acknowledging that achievement. That's true. Excellent publisher, excellent blurbs, excellent reviews, excellent academic pedigree, and yet, and despite, and notwithstanding, the book is a complete fraud from beginning to end. In fact, the only question that arises with Professor Dershowitz's book is whether the fraud begins with the first word on the first page, or whether it begins with the alleged author's name on the cover of the book. So, apart from that, it's completely uncontroversial. Now, it's an interesting story about that book, which I'll belabor with you for 5 minutes, and then we move on to the questions. Because it tells you a lot about American intellectual life, and American academic life, and the media, and how they function in the United States. The problem was not, in my case, demonstrating the book was a fraud. The problem was publicizing it. The demonstration was pretty straightforward. I simply went through all the human rights records and juxtaposed professors' claims against what the Human Rights Report said. Very simple, no complicated methodology. And it was quite clear that he falsified Israel's human rights record, sometimes in quite egregious ways. Produced the manuscript probably in no more than 8 months, and then the problems began. First, Professor Dershowitz started writing letters of his own to my publisher, originally the New Press, suggesting he was going to sue for libel. The New Press was concerned. and I switched to University of California at Berkeley. At that point, Professor Dershowitz then wrote more letters, and then when that didn't work, he recruited what's reputed to be the most powerful law firm in the country, Cravath, Moore, and Swain, to suppress publication of the book. When that didn't work, he went to the Terminator, he went to the governor of California, Arnold Schwarzenegger, to block publication of the book, because as governor, he's an ex officio member of the Board of Regents, which makes those sorts of decisions. To Schwarzenegger's credit, he replied in a public statement that this was a matter of academic freedom, and he refused to intervene. Whether he knew what he was talking about, I don't know. And the book was published. You would think, first of all, yes, University of California Press, it was under tremendous pressure, not because they thought they would lose the libel suit. As they kept telling me, the problem with libel suits is they never get to court. They're always settled out of court. And I said, if Professor Dershowitz sues us in New York, we don't even have the money to fly out the lawyers to New York. So they were fearful of the accumulated costs when you go up against Cravath, Swain, and Moore, that it would bankrupt them. They published the book, and it is a victory, but I'd have to say it's a very partial victory. Number one, as you can imagine, a book which bears on fraud, plagiarism. Professor Dershowitz had generously plagiarized another hoax on the Israel-Palestine conflict called From Time Immemorial. Plagiarism, fraud, fabrication. It deals with the Israel-Palestine conflict. It deals with a Harvard professor. Those are the elements, the components of a spectacular scandal, a lot of which was publicized before the book's publication. Notwithstanding, the book did not receive one mainstream review in the United States. Not a single one. Literally not one. Some people imagine that I must be bitter. And I'll admit, I have my failings and frailties. I was bitter at the beginning, but the bitterness eventually metamorphosed into awe. I was so impressed by that level of party unity and party discipline. Party discipline. Having been in one part of my life a person of the Marxist left, I had to think hard for a precedent. When had I seen party discipline and party unity of this magnitude? The first thought that came to my mind was the People's Republic of Albania under Enver Hoxha. For those of you who know that, there was impressive discipline and unity. But then I said no. I thought about it, I pondered it, I ruminated it, because there was some precedent I knew from my distant past, which was the obvious precursor for this unity. And it came to mind. It was the 1938 meeting of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. It was very united. There wasn't a single heap of dissent. It was very disciplined. They all cheered Chairman Stalin Like now they cheer Chairman Dershowitz. Why? Because in 1937, Stalin killed every member of the Central Committee when it met in the Soviet Union. So in 1938, they were very disciplined and very unanimous in their support of the chairman. The difference in the United States is no one needs to be shot, nobody needs to be threatened to be sent to a psychiatric ward. When it comes to the Israel-Palestine conflict, everyone knows exactly what to do and what not to do for the glorious cause. Is that cause for dismay and a feeling that the cause is hopeless? Actually, I don't believe that at all. I think the cause is very much not hopeless. But there's excellent rational grounds for optimism. And the excellent rational grounds for optimism are the ones I went over with you, or we went over together this evening. Namely, there are powerful weapons on our side. They're not guns, they're not money, and they're not occupying the seats of power. There are other kinds of weapons, but I think equally potent, there's the weapon of truth. That's a powerful weapon. And the truth is on our side. There's another powerful weapon. It's the weapon of justice. And the weapon of justice is on our side. That's why there's unanimity in the human rights community, there's unanimity in the United Nations, there's unanimity in the World Court. It's a simple, uncomplicated truth and a simple and uncomplicated principle of justice. Not, as Professor Barhoum mentioned earlier, it's not a borderline issue. It's an uncomplicated one. Israel's occupation of the West Bank and Gaza, Israel's occupation of Gaza and the West Bank. It's immoral, it's indefensible, it's criminal. Very uncomplicated, a very uncomplicated truth, a very uncomplicated principle of justice. And our job is to learn how to wield those weapons of truth and justice. That's hard work, learning how to wield those weapons. But once we learn how to wield them, and in addition, the opposition is now proving to be more and more ineffective in suppressing the truth and suppressing the elementary principles of justice, of which the Jimmy Carter episode is certainly indicative. They're proving more ineffective in suppressing it. I would say now, more than ever, I'm optimistic. If we do the hard work, show a little backbone, show a little courage, I think we can win. Thank you. Professor Barhoum a favor. I was very impressed when I watched on the internet the presentation by Jimmy Carter, that after his presentation, the most difficult and controversial questions were put to him. For those of you who watched it, there were no softballs, or as somebody put it, this was not batting practice. So I'm hoping that Professor Barhoum will show no deference to my sensibilities and will put to me the hard questions and the tough questions, and we'll see where it comes out.
How about opening it up?
I'll tell you the truth. Allow me. Had I been asked, I would have said I prefer that. On the other hand, I have to respect the decisions made by the organizers. They invited me. One last comment. I trust that Professor Barhoum will not make this a rigged session. I have faith in him. Maybe I'm wrong, but I do. And let's see what happens.
All right. First softball question, Mark. Are you a Jew attempting to gain the love of those trying to destroy the brave little country of Israel?
Number one, I obviously am Jewish. Number two, I have no doubt, to speak honestly, we shouldn't play games, that I get special kinds of credibility because I am Jewish and because of what my parents passed through during World War II. And I'm not going to deny that. On the other hand, I do think people have the capacity for weighing arguments and judging, regardless of my background, am I making a convincing case? This is, after all, not a circus. It's Stanford University. You're quite capable of saying, yes, he's Jewish, yes, his parents passed through this and that, but no, I don't think he's right. And throughout my remarks, I tried as best I could to stick to the factual record and not try to load my argument with my ethnicity or my family background. On the other hand, I'm not about to disown it. I am the son of my late parents, and I take great pride in that fact, and not for a moment would I deny it. Go ahead.
All right, softball question number two. If the human rights for Arabs in Israel are so terrible, why do they prefer to live there rather than go back to their original Arab countries?
Well, first on the technical point. On the technical point, none of my remarks this evening had any bearing on the question of the Arabs in Israel. I was talking about the Arabs under occupation in the West Bank and Gaza. That's number one. Number two, it's as if to say to African Americans, if things were so bad under slavery, why don't you go back to Africa? It seems to me the obvious moral response is to recognize the courage and the dignity of those who refuse to leave but prefer to remain and fight to improve their lives. That's honorable.
You have argued against Mishheimer and Walt's thesis that the U.S.'s close tie to Israel is no longer in our country's national interest. Should the U.S. cut all ties with Israel, and how worried are you that this will affect our national interest in the Middle East?
I won't go into the Wald-Mearsheimer argument right now. I'll just make a brief comment. For those of you who aren't familiar with it, it was the paper which acquired a certain amount of notoriety when it was published in the London Review of Books. Professor Wald was at the time the dean at the Kennedy School at Harvard. Professor Mearsheimer is a distinguished chair at University of Chicago. And basically they argued that Israel is a liability for the United States, the U.S. national interest, and that this liability remains so effective because of the Israel lobby. I think in a nutshell, that's what they were saying. I don't agree with that on many counts. Just to take the case of this past summer, Walter Mearsheimer subsequently said that Israel's disastrous war in Lebanon and all of its awful repercussions for the United States prove once again that Israel is a liability for the United States. I agree with the analysis of the head of Hezbollah, Mr. Nasrallah. During the war, he repeatedly said, this is not an Israeli war, this is an American war. This is American financed, American planned, American executed, and Israel is just doing the bidding of the United States. I think that's a more accurate depiction. It is not the tail wagging the dog, it's the dog who's very much wagging the tail. On the broader question, I don't think there's any need to indulge in radical kinds of demands and extremist sorts of demands which are just going to alienate people. I think this is right. Former President Jimmy Carter has now legitimized the use of the term apartheid to describe what Israel is constructing or has constructed in the occupied territories. Now, as some of you may know, and all of you ought to know, under the additional Protocol 1 to the Geneva Convention, the 1977 Protocol, apartheid is a war crime under international law. Under the Rome Statutes of the International Criminal Court, apartheid is a war crime. And all that we should ask is that the United States acquit itself legally with the responsibilities that accrue to it against a regime that commits or is engaged in war crimes, criminal acts under international law. And if we simply apply that standard, and then we look into the law books and say, what do you have to do? Do you have to cut off all aid that's used for weaponry? Then you do it. I don't think we have to invent grandiose things like the United States cut off every last cent to Israel. If international law requires that, then the answer is yes. And if it doesn't, I see no need to indulge those sorts of tactics which are just going to alienate people. You use the same sorts of tactics and engage in the same kinds of legitimacy which were used to eventually end the apartheid regime in South Africa. Not more, not less.
Israel as a state was founded in 1948 on stolen land which was occupied by force and massive bloodshed. International law deems that it is inadmissible to keep land acquired by force. Can't your argument lead to the conclusion that all of Israel is occupied territory?
I'm going to answer that by saying I think that's another one of those complicated questions. It is. true, I think, that under international law, and it's a complicated subject, under international law, by 1948, it probably was correct to say acquiring territory by war. It's a complicated question, scholars disagree. It was illegal. You have to remember, the law changed very radically in the 20th century. Up until 1928, up until what's called the Kellogg-Briand Pact, up until the Kellogg-Briand Agreement, up until then, war was legal. You were allowed to wage war, a state was allowed legally to wage war to achieve its aims. There were some constraints put on that principle by the League of Nations Covenant, but the League of Nations Covenant did not abolish war as a right, raison d'etat, as a reason of state. It first begins to be abolished around 1928 with the Kellogg-Briand Agreement. I'm not sure what it's called, agreement or pact. Pact, correct? Yeah. As a matter of fact, it was a very controversial question at the time of the Nuremberg trials for the Nazis, whether or not they could be tried for crimes against peace, because it wasn't fully clear whether whether war, a crime against peace, was legal or not. And the same question arises with this matter of acquiring territory by war. It's a complicated legal question. I can only say what's factually known, that a complicated question had arisen by 1947, and the sentiment of the United Nations General Assembly was to resolve that complicated situation, which was the result of force. The force